This happened about a year ago during a camping trip to the forests of Kentucky in the dead of winter. My girlfriend at the time, 3 of my closest buddies, and I decided to spend a long weekend hiking, exploring, and enjoying the serenity of nature. Little did we know, this trip would turn into something straight out of a horror movie. We arrived late on a Friday night, close to midnight. The campsite was eerily quiet, save for a few other campers, a young couple whose tent was set up a bit down the road, and an older man staying in a rundown trailer farther in the opposite direction. The dense forest around us seemed to swallow all sound, making even our quiet chatter echo unnaturally as we unloaded the cars and set up camp under the faint glow of our headlamps. As we were setting up tents, my girlfriend tugged on my sleeve and motioned toward a shadowy figure standing near us. It was the young woman from the nearby campsite. She stepped into the light, and that's when we noticed something was off about her. Her skin looked pale and blotchy, like she had been scratching at it for days, and her eyes were glassy, almost lifeless. Her voice was monotone as she introduced herself and casually mentioned how she and her boyfriend loved camping in remote places. Her presence was unsettling, but it was her boyfriend, or husband, we weren't sure, that truly gave us the creeps. We hadn't even noticed him at first, but soon realized he was lingering just at the edge of the woods, watching us silently. His figure was barely illuminated by the faint beam of his flashlight, making it even more unnerving. He didn't say a word, just stood there like a shadow, his eyes fixed on us. After what felt like an eternity, he retreated to their campsite, and the woman soon excused herself, saying she had to go. We figured that would be the end of the strange encounter, but within minutes, the man drove his car right up to our campsite, headlights blazing into our tents. The high beams blinded us, and for a moment, we couldn't see anything beyond the glaring light. My girlfriend gripped my arm tightly, her unease mirroring my own. After a tense minute, the car reversed and returned to their campsite, leaving us shaken but trying to shrug it off. Later that night, as we tried to sleep, we heard raised voices coming from their direction. The couple was arguing loudly, their voices cutting through the stillness of the woods. The argument escalated quickly into shouting, then to what sounded like a full-blown fight. Suddenly, the sharp sound of breaking glass shattered the night. By now, all of us were wide awake and on edge, debating whether we should intervene or stay put. Before we could decide, the roar of an engine broke the tension. The man sped off in his car, gravel spraying against our tents as he tore down the dirt road. For a moment, there was silence, just the faint sound of the woman sobbing at their campsite. My girlfriend and I started getting dressed, thinking we might check on her, but before we could step out, the car came screaming back up the road and skidded to a halt. More shouting erupted, this time even more panicked and chaotic. Then, 2 loud pops echoed through the trees. They sounded unmistakably like gunshots. I felt the blood drain from my face as adrenaline kicked in. My girlfriend and I froze in the tent, holding our breath, straining to hear what was happening. For several agonizing minutes, there was nothing but silence. Then, the shouting resumed, quieter this time, almost like they were trying to cover up the earlier commotion. By the time things settled down, it was close to 4 a.m., and we were too exhausted and scared to do anything but collapse into uneasy sleep. When we woke up the next morning, the couple was gone. Their tent, car, and everything else had vanished as if they'd never been there. We exchanged uneasy glances as we recounted the night's events over breakfast. As we packed up our gear, the older man from the trailer approached us. He seemed friendly enough at first, but his words sent a chill down my spine. Glancing at my girlfriend, he remarked in a low voice, "You shouldn't have brought her here. It's not safe for women in these parts." His words echoed in my mind as we hastily packed up and decided to find a new campsite far away from there. We drove deeper into the state park and eventually found a serene lakeside spot to spend the next night. It was picturesque, the kind of place we'd been hoping for from the start. Though the rest of the trip was uneventful, the memory of that eerie night lingered. To this day, I can't help but wonder what might have happened if we'd stayed at that first campsite. The argument, the gunshot-like sounds, the strange warning from the older man, it all felt like a brush with something sinister. That winter camping trip left us with more than just memories of beautiful landscapes, it left us with a story none of us will ever forget. A couple of years ago, I was overwhelmed with the chaos of college life and the constant noise of living in a big city. I decided I needed to unplug and find some peace in the way only nature can provide. My idea of a perfect escape? A long weekend alone in the deep woods, far from people, responsibilities, and the endless distractions of urban life. I planned everything meticulously, as I always do. I'm an experienced outdoors enthusiast, and while solo winter camping might sound like the beginning of a true crime podcast episode to some, I felt entirely in control. My dad, who had always hoped I'd embrace his rugged, no-nonsense way of life, would have been proud of me, his white trash warrior, as he used to joke. The further I drove from the city, the wilder the landscape became. It was freeing. By the time I parked my car in a secluded roadside ditch, the world felt refreshingly empty. With a map, a compass, and my gear, I hiked deep into the woods until I was about 4 miles from the road and within reach of a promising ice fishing spot. I set up camp discreetly, tucking my tiny tent into a clearing surrounded by dense trees. A small fire flickered in the cold air as I sat alone under the stars, relishing the stillness. The first 2 days were pure bliss. I spent my time hiking, fishing, and simply existing in the quiet of the forest. But on the third day, everything changed. That morning, I trekked to the fishing hole I'd marked on my map. The snow crunched under my boots, and the world was wrapped in a kind of winter silence that made every sound seem amplified. My navigation skills paid off. I reached the exact spot I had intended. After punching through a thin layer of ice, I began fishing. My first catch came quickly, a decent-sized fish eager to escape the icy water. As I worked to clean it, I realized just how rusty my preparation skills had become. I nicked my fingers several times, muttering curses under my breath. Then, something strange happened. I became aware of a faint whistling. At first, I thought it might have been the wind, but it had a deliberate, almost playful rhythm. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, just at the edge of my hearing. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the slippery fish that kept sliding from my hands. The whistling grew more irritating, like a buzzing insect you can't swat away. Finally, I lost my temper and shouted, "Can you knock it off?" expecting to hear a startled bird flap away or maybe even the voice of another camper apologizing. Instead, there was nothing. No reply, no sound, just silence so complete it made my heart race. That's when it hit me, there shouldn't be anyone out here. I was miles from the road, and the only reason anyone would be this deep in the woods would be to hunt. But hunters wouldn't whistle like that. And if it wasn't a hunter, who, or what, was it? My nerves were rattled. I abandoned the fish, packed up my gear, and started back toward camp. As I neared the site, something caught my eye. A large, dark mass protruded from the snow. Against my better judgment, I approached. It was a moose, a massive one, clearly dead. Its lifeless eyes seemed to stare right at me, and I felt an inexplicable sense of dread. The kill was fresh, far too fresh. I examined it closer, noticing a clean bullet wound in its head. It didn't make sense. Hunters don't leave kills to waste, especially not something as valuable as a moose. And dragging an animal that size out of the woods? Nearly impossible. The scene made my skin crawl. Without another thought, I bolted. I ran through the snow, lungs burning, barely keeping my bearings. When I finally saw my car through the trees, I felt a wave of relief like never before. I jumped in and drove to the first motel I could find, leaving all my belongings behind. That night, as I sat watching bad late-night television, the pieces began to click. Why would the Park Service allow camping in the same area as active hunting grounds? Why hadn't I heard a gunshot? And most unsettling of all, why did I feel like I wasn't alone in those woods? The next morning, I called the park ranger to report what I'd seen. He sounded more annoyed than concerned, chalking it up to illegal hunting. But when I agreed to take him to the site, his demeanor changed. We rode out together on an ATV. When we arrived, the moose was gone, but the bloodstains in the snow told the story. Drag marks led away from the site, as if the carcass had been hauled off on a tarp. The ranger seemed uneasy now, muttering about how unusual the situation was. Then I pointed out where my camp had been, right in the direction of the drag marks. Later that evening, I got a call from the ranger. He sounded shaken. "Miss, I don't think you'll want your belongings back," he said darkly. "Someone cut into your tent with a knife. The whole site's a mess." That was the last I heard about it. No answers, no closure. In the years since, I've tried to rationalize what happened. Was it a hunter with poor judgment? A prank gone too far? Or something far darker? One thing I know for sure, I'll never go into the woods alone again. I was on a job traveling across California, tasked with upgrading shelving at CVS pharmacies. The work was tedious but straightforward, and it gave me the chance to see parts of the state I'd never visited. About a month into the contract, I found myself on a long stretch of highway deep in the redwoods, heading toward my next site. The drive was over 100 miles, and as I cruised along, the towering trees forming a canopy overhead, I noticed something unpleasant. I smelled bad. It wasn't just a slight funk either. It was the kind of smell that would make a client wrinkle their nose the moment I walked in. I couldn't show up like this, especially since first impressions mattered. I needed to find a way to clean up and change clothes before arriving. About 40 miles into the isolated highway, I spotted a sign for a campground at the next exit. A campground wasn't exactly my first choice, but desperate times called for desperate measures. I veered off the highway and followed a narrow road until I pulled into a small, rundown camp. It had maybe 15 spots arranged in a tight circle, and the place looked completely deserted. No cars, no tents, just silence. The whole area had an eerie, abandoned vibe, but I saw a small bathhouse near the edge of the lot. That was all I needed. I grabbed my towel and a change of clothes from the truck, trying to shake off the unease creeping in. It was probably just my imagination, I told myself. As I approached the bathhouse, I heard water running. That immediately struck me as strange. The camp was empty, so who could possibly be inside? My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was a pot farmer, or perhaps someone homeless seeking shelter. Could it be a meth lab hidden in the woods? The thought made me pause, but I decided to push forward. Whoever it was, I figured they wouldn't care about me using a shower stall on the other end of the building. The bathhouse was grimy, but the stalls were equipped with thick metal doors that locked securely with a heavy bolt. That gave me a small sense of security. The showers operated with quarters, so I stripped down, dropped in a few coins, and felt a small relief as warm water started flowing. That relief didn't last long. Almost immediately, I heard a commotion in the other stall, the one with the running water. Someone was yelling, their voice angry and loud. "What the expletive?" they shouted, followed by sounds of struggling. My stomach dropped. Had I stolen their hot water? The thought made me feel guilty, but there was nothing I could do now. The water kept running, and I stepped under the stream, hoping the person would let it go. But they didn't. A loud bang against my stall door made me jump. The man was screaming now, slamming his fists, or maybe his feet, against the metal. The door shook with every hit. My heart pounded as I realized he was trying to break in. I was completely naked, dripping wet, and utterly vulnerable. Instinctively, I backed into the corner of the stall, fists raised, ready to defend myself. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on me. Fighting someone while naked wasn't exactly how I envisioned my day going. For a brief moment, I considered trying to put on my pants, but I dismissed the idea. If the door gave way while I was halfway through, I'd be done for. Fear gripped me. This wasn't like a bar fight where there were rules and people to break it up if things went too far. We were miles from civilization, and no one would hear me if I screamed. What if this guy didn't stop once he got inside? Was this fight to the death in his mind? I forced myself to stay calm, focusing on my breathing to keep from panicking. The banging continued, each hit louder and more desperate than the last. I could feel the vibrations through the metal, and I braced myself for the door to give at any moment. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. Silence. I stood frozen, listening for any sign of movement. My heart was racing, every muscle in my body tensed. "Hey man," I called out cautiously, my voice shaking. "I'm sorry. I'll give you more quarters if you want." No response. I waited a few more minutes, my ears straining for any sound. Finally, I allowed myself to relax, just a little. Maybe he'd calmed down and decided to leave. I took a deep breath, stepped back under the water, and tried to finish my shower as quickly as possible. But then another thought hit me, my truck. It was parked just outside, and it held a few $1,000s worth of tools. If he couldn't get to me, what if he decided to break into the truck instead? Losing that equipment would be a disaster. My fear reignited, and I knew I couldn't waste another second. I jumped out of the shower, threw on my pants, and bolted out of the stall. Water still dripping from my hair, I ran toward the parking area, my bare feet slapping against the cold, damp floor. As I rounded the corner of the bathhouse, my heart was in my throat. But to my immense relief, the lot was empty. The man was gone, and my truck was untouched. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath and trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was that guy? Why was he so angry? And where had he gone? The camp was still completely deserted, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. I didn't stick around to find out. I threw the rest of my clothes on, climbed into my truck, and got out of there as fast as I could. To this day, I have no idea who that man was or why he reacted the way he did. Maybe he was just another traveler, stressed and on edge, or maybe he was someone far more dangerous. Whatever the case, I've never been back to that campground, and I don't plan on stopping at another one anytime soon. To the mysterious wilderness dweller, please, let's all just chill.